that we were talking about this morning during the lesson. We introduced the topic, which is commonly known as the problem of evil. And we've noted that the presence of evil and suffering and questions about these things, these are issues that affect us all. And that many see, or at least they claim to see, evil and suffering in the world as valid reasons not to believe in God. And the reality is they turn out to be arguments for God. And that's connected to one of the fundamental flaws in the argument itself, because it points to evil in the world, it complains about evil in the world, and then tries to deny the only standard by which you could possibly call anything evil, that is the ultimate standard of good, which is God. And it assumes that the purpose of this world and this life are in effect just to be heaven, a place where nothing ever goes wrong, no one is ever disappointed, ever hurt, no injustices ever occur. And one of our songs that we sung just now kind of, made it clear that that's not this place. That's another place that God has in mind for us, that we ought to be longing for. But this idea that the world ought to be heaven itself is a purely human idea. And it leads to all kinds of other problems, by the way, other than this problem of evil. It leads to this notion that this earth is something to be worshipped in and of itself, when in fact it's simply the place that God has created for us to live in and to sustain us for as long as he allows time to go on. The idea that comes from God and his word is that the purpose for this life, the purpose for this world, is to develop and prepare our souls for an eternity with him in heaven. And we noted that God created us with free will, and he has given us an environment in which to exercise that free will. And that has a big impact on our perception and our understanding of the evil and the suffering that we see in the world around us. And a lot of it connects to our trust in not only God's power, not only God's goodness, but God's knowledge, God's wisdom, God's perspective on things. And so for the next few minutes now, I want us just to look rather briefly at some examples of evil and suffering that we encounter in this life, which, when you think about it, especially when you think about it dispassionately, which is easier to do when you're not hurting, granted, but when we can look at things from a distance in light of what God has revealed to us, we can look at a number of examples of evil and suffering, and they're not difficult to understand at all. They're pretty much an inevitable consequence of the kind of world we have. And again, some of these aren't going to be any revelation, but there's not a thing wrong with going through things again in our minds and setting them forth in an orderly fashion so that we don't forget, and so that we're potentially better prepared to talk to people about this subject should it come up. Evil and suffering sometimes occur in this world because of our own bad choices. It's just that simple. We do things that are at best not smart, or at worst downright evil. There's a pretty good spectrum in between those two, range of choices, but we do things that fall somewhere in that category, and bad consequences result, and it winds up hurting us. Well, why would we blame anyone else for that? Why would anyone else who's mature and honest blame someone else for their own bad decisions? And there's so many ways of illustrating this. It could be something as simple and relatively trivial as the carpenter who doesn't pay close enough attention while he's hammering the nail, or using the circular saw to cut a piece of board. Or it could get much more significant, such as the pilot who doesn't maintain himself in a proper condition to fly an airplane, or doesn't conduct his required pre-flight safety checks, or doesn't pay attention to the weather, any number of things, and as a result, crashes his airplane. Right? Well, whose fault is that? Except for the person who made the bad choices. And, again, the examples of this just go on and on. But you remember this morning we talked about the example from Judges chapter 6 of Gideon. And the Midianites are just continually harassing Israel, and the angel comes to Gideon and says, God's with you. And he says, if God's with us, why is all of this happening to us? Well, the answer is in verse 1 of Judges chapter 6. Israel did that which was evil in God's sight, and so he delivered them into the hands of the Midianites for 7 years. Bad choices, bad consequences. And we're going to come to this later, but I'll go ahead and mention it. That's one of the benefits of bad consequences. They help us learn what bad choices are. If there were never any difference, there'd be no such thing as a good choice versus a bad choice. It all turns out exactly the same way regardless. All right? But again, if I decide, I'm tired of working for a living, I'm just going to rob banks instead, and I get caught and I get thrown in prison, whose fault is that? Is that God's fault? Can a mature, rational person not see that it's wrong to steal? And at the very best, even if you can't convince yourself that it's wrong to steal, it's risky in terms of the consequences that you might face. And so, again, we can all think of more examples along this line, but that makes the point, and that's the most obvious one. There's so much suffering that people encounter in the world because they make bad choices. And again, bad could be nothing but just poor judgment in the moment. It could be just downright evil. But then a lot of suffering also occurs in this world because of the bad choices of other people that, we're in contact with. First of all, the people that we just bump up against on a day-to-day basis. And, somebody might say, well, that's not fair. Well, free will in human beings has to mean free will in human beings, or it's not really free will, or you've got something else, you've got human beings here and some other category of something over here. So if human beings have free will, they all have free will. And they all have the ability to make bad choices. And sometimes those bad choices affect more people than just, the one who's making the bad choice. Sometimes it only affects other people, at least from a physical standpoint, right? And so this is just the case. It's a function of the way God has created the world. Acts chapter 10 and verse 34 and Romans chapter 2 and verse 11 both remind us that God is no respecter of persons. His standard for the way he is going to treat people and what he wants for people and the basis on which he will accept people into his fellowship, they're the same for everyone. They don't change. And so everyone has the same free will, the same ability to choose God or to reject God, to make good choices or to make bad choices. And we can think about this in two senses. I've already mentioned in the first place, there's the contemporary sense, people that we come into contact with in our day-to-day lives. So someone gets drunk and gets in an automobile and crashes into our car, best case, we've got significant damage to our car. Worst case, people are dead because somebody else made a horrible choice. That's the nature of the world that we live in, where people can choose for themselves. It means I might get mugged by someone. It means my house might get broken into and robbed. It means a baby may be aborted. Like somebody just didn't want to deal with that. Think about wars and how many people are affected by wars and how much suffering and evil occurs in wars. And generally it comes down to the evil decisions of a very small number of people when you get down to it, but the effects that it can have are just huge. And we're going to talk about effects of individual events a little bit later on and how big they can be relative to where they started. But it's not just the people that we're in contact with in the here and now. A lot of times we can be hurt because of the poor decisions of former generations, people who lived before us. And God warned the Israelites about this in Exodus chapter 20, verses 5 and 6. He warned them that their sin and their rebellion would have long-lasting effects. That generations down after them would still be feeling the effects of their rebellion, their decision to turn away from God. And of course, you can argue from a very large-scale standpoint, anybody in the world right now who doesn't have any kind of direct knowledge of God other than what they can see in nature has their ancestors to thank for it somewhere back in the line. Because there was a time in this world when everyone knew God. the God of the Bible, the only true God. And so people can be affected negatively by the decisions of people who came before them. So, babies can be born addicted to drugs and or deformed because of terrible decisions that their mothers made while carrying them. Innocent children, all over the world may be denied proper medical treatment. They may be severely malnourished because their parents embraced false religions, false ideas. Could be something as simple as someone's just born with a bad name, a bad reputation because of the kind of people their parents or grandparents were. And so they're saddled with that. That's just something that they have to deal with. It's no fault of their own, but they have to endure the consequences of bad choices that people who came before them made. And again, people might really be tempted, and they're not just tempted, they do it. They say, well, that's not fair. Well, why should I have to, it's enough for me to face, bad consequences from either my own actions or people that I live in contact with. It's not fair that people living before me, I'm still having to pay the price for their bad decisions. But again, there's no way of escaping that in a world where creatures like human beings have free will. And it's also valid to point out that in addition to having to face all the bad consequences for bad decisions that people who came before us may have made, we also get all the benefits of the good decisions that people who came before us made. And so that applies to so many, medical breakthroughs and scientific breakthroughs. I mean, if we really made a concerted effort to list all of those, it'd run into the hundreds, I have no doubt, probably far beyond that. So many of them we're not even really conscious of anymore, or we've never had any consciousness of them. We take them for granted because there's never been a time in our lives when we didn't have access to this particular technology, this particular advancement or benefit. So it's a two-way street, right? Human beings can make great decisions and have very positive outcomes. They can make horrible decisions and have very bad outcomes. Again, no other way for it to be when people have free will. And if only one side of that equation is possible, that's not really free will. So, good consequences as well as bad. People sometimes want to point to various diseases and physical ailments as, examples of evil in the world. And this is especially true when they, affect people who are perceived as just obviously being innocent, like little children. Why should a little child have to be, struck with this disease and suffer from it and possibly die from it? Now, it's valid to point out here that a lot of different organisms that exist in this world that can be very damaging and harmful in one setting can be very helpful in other settings, right? So it's again, well, who's going to control, how that's going to work all the time? Is it going to be very selective in how it works? Imagine a world where, the bacteria that are responsible for degrading waste materials just didn't exist, just stopped working. Think about what the world would get like very quickly. And so, again, there's two sides of the issue, and sadly, and a lot of times it's because of the pain and emotion involved. When people are thinking about this, they just completely ignore the positive side of it. There's a positive side and a negative side to most of these things, right? But, again, in thinking about the issues of various diseases and physical maladies and ailments, if we trust God, and we trust the story that he tells us about the world that he made, then we know that the beginning of the physical problems for human beings, not just the spiritual, but the physical problems as well, was when Adam and Eve were expelled from the garden and denied access to the tree of life in Genesis chapter 3. And why was that? It was because of sin. It was because they chose to rebel against God, to disobey God. And so they were promised at that point that their lives were going to be much more difficult and much less comfortable from then on. And the world still faces the consequences for those decisions. And again, to be very clear, we don't share in their guilt at all. We've got our own guilt, plenty of it, all right? But guilt and consequences are two different things. We do have to face the consequences for that initial decision and the changes that it brought about in this world and to our lives as human beings. Well, what about, someone might say, all the suffering due to various meteorological and geophysical phenomena, things like hurricanes, and floods and tornadoes and volcanic eruptions and earthquakes, all of that sort of stuff. Why do those things have to happen? So many people, are hurt or killed by those things. Well, if you think about it and you study the matter a little bit, there is really no question that all of these phenomena that we just mentioned are connected to, and they're influenced by, at the very least, all of the drastically different features of this planet. We've got areas where you've got significant water bodies, and then we've got significant land masses. And both the water bodies and the land masses have significant thermal gradients, temperature variations from one spot to another. You got mountain ranges, you got canyons, you got deserts, you've got significant pressure variations, you've got fault lines, you've got tectonic plates, you've got all that stuff. And that's how we get the types of weather and geophysical phenomena like earthquakes and volcanoes that we get from time to time on this planet. Well, how did the earth get like that? The answer is really easy. It's in Genesis chapter 6 through 8. It happened during the worldwide flood. Many people have the idea, and it's just because of limited Bible study or careful thought about the matter, that, when God flooded the earth, if he really did flood the earth, it was just a matter of lots of rain till everything was covered up and he flooded the earth. No, that's not how he did it. It was a combination of rain for certain. But the record also says that he broke up the crust of the earth and brought up subterranean waters. That's how the world got like it is today. So it's very true to say that we live in a world which is broken spiritually and broken physically. And it's all because of sin. It all goes back to sin and its connection with our free choices and the ability that people have to do things that affect others. But it's also important to notice that when we see examples, and we think of examples of suffering in this world, that this is a world that is governed by a natural law. And that being the case, there's a certain amount of suffering that's just inevitable. And again, when people just, they're kind of thinking about this emotionally or not very deeply, when they see that happening to people they perceive as innocent, well, they think of that as evil, right? And so, if, for example, the law of gravity and other laws of physics behave consistently, then things may fall down from time to time. And if people are in the way, then they may get hurt or killed from time to time. Jesus addressed this specifically in Luke chapter 13, verses 4 and 5. He referenced the collapse of the Tower of Siloam. Fell down, killed 18 people. And he said, do you think those 18 people were any more evil than the next 18 people, to paraphrase? And the answer was no. It's just one of those things that happens from time to time in a world that's made up of physical things and governed by physical laws, by natural laws. It's just an inescapable consequence of the kind of world we live in. So, whether it's laws of gravity or electricity or force or motion, they're impersonal. They just are. They don't care that someone is about to get hurt by running afoul of them. It's going to happen anyway. So, if I step off a 20-story building, aside from any artificial assistance, I'm going down and not up, and I'm going down fast. And when I stop going down fast, I'm going to go splat. That's just the kind of world that we live in, and there's no getting around that if we live in a world governed by natural law. Now, a lot of times the skeptic will want to say, well, why doesn't God stop that from happening? If he's all powerful, he could do that. He could just step in and keep that from happening. At least if somebody innocent is going to get hurt by it, right? Well, then the question becomes, well, how often do you want God to do that? And exactly for whom? Who gets to make those decisions? And, what, for example, happens if suspending the law over here to save this person some misery causes some collateral damage over here, causes somebody else to get hurt? Who gets to make that call? What human being is qualified to make calls like that? And if God is just perpetually stepping in to suspend, some natural law because somebody's about to get hurt, then the concept of natural law ceases to exist. Now we've got chaos. Walk outside, you never know if the gravity's going to be on or off because somebody might get hurt by it being on right then. Life would not be possible. And so the reality is, and not to intend to sound unkind, but someone who seriously asked the question, why can't God just stop that from happening on a case-by-case basis, just doesn't have any idea what they're actually proposing. That kind of world would argue far more for atheism than it would for God. It's just chaos. You'd never know what to expect, when you walked outside your door on any given day. It reminds me of a movie. I'm not even going to mention the title. It was a somewhat irreverent movie, but it had a good message at its heart. It was about a fellow that just was fed up with things not going well in his life. And so he, in effect, just shook his fist at God and, blamed him for it all. And so God decided just to let him be God for a day or a week or whatever it was to see how well he did at it, to see how he could manage it. And one of the huge mistakes that he made and lessons that he learned was and I won't even try to go into this detail, but he's getting everybody's prayer requests. He's just getting flooded with prayer requests. And so he just decides, well, the simple thing to do is just say, blanket yes, there we go. And that's what he did. And all kinds of chaos ensued because this human being getting what they wanted caused problems somewhere else. And, that's what the person is asking for who says it's just not right, it's just not fair that people get hurt because we live in a world by natural law and that's God's fault and he ought to do something about it. Think about, again, all of the benefits we get because we live in a world that's governed by natural law. So many amazing ways. And it would be absolutely impossible if we didn't live in a world that was governed by natural laws. All the benefits we have in technology, air conditioning, lighting, paint, insulation, doors, locks, there's no end to it in terms of our ability to properly catalog it or even appreciate it. All of that is a result of people making good choices to study God's creation, to identify predictable phenomena within that creation, and to harness that in some way to improve our lives. None of that's possible if God's just going to selectively, let's just turn that one off here, turn that one off here, right? So again, there is a flip side to it. And then it's also really important to realize when we think about the issue of suffering and pain that we have to go through in various ways, that it has benefits. It has undeniable benefits. And this applies in the physical realm as well as the mental or the spiritual realm or the emotional realm. I would imagine, pretty much everybody in here, at one point in your life, you had some childhood fantasies about things that it would be really neat to be able to do, capabilities that it would be great to have. We tend to call those superpowers. What would be your ideal superpower if you could have it? And, probably some of the more common ones would be flying. Right, that was one of mine at various times. Super strength, right? That's another good one, right? I had that one too. But one of mine that I'd periodically think about was it would be really neat just not to feel any pain. So no matter what happens to me, I don't feel any pain. Nothing, can hurt me, right? Well, what if we actually felt no pain? Well, there are people, and it's a rare condition, but there are people who know the answer to that. And it's an extremely dangerous condition to have. It exists. The acronym for it is CIPA, And the CIP part stands for congenital insensitivity to pain. And people who have this, excuse me, there's just, the pain sensing nerves are just not properly connected to the brain. And I know that's something that Dad wishes he had in particular right now with regard to certain nerves. But the fact is, pain, physical pain, can be, not that it always is, but it can be very beneficial. People who have that condition that cannot feel pain, they have all kinds of terrible problems. They chew their tongues off and their lips off, never even realizing what they're doing. They burn themselves horribly and don't even know they've done it because they can't feel any pain. And so pain can be very beneficial in our lives, whether it's chest pains, that send us to the doctor in a hurry to find out what's wrong, abdominal pains. Forgive the personal example, but it's the best one that I know of personally. In 2004, I was just all of a sudden experiencing some pretty severe abdominal pains and had no idea, what was causing it. So got, kind of rushed as fast as Laurie would drive to the emergency room kind of late in the evening. And early the next morning, they were doing emergency surgery to unkink my small intestine, which had somehow gotten kinked. They never had a good explanation for that. But the point is, there's no doubt about it, I could have easily died if I hadn't gone to get that looked at. And I never would have gone to get that looked at without the pain that I was experiencing. And so that's what pain does for us on so many occasions in so many ways, whether it's, headaches or whatever. And as we mentioned earlier, pain can be a very beneficial teacher in helping us understand bad decisions. This is probably a very familiar scenario. A little child is telling, don't touch that stove, hot. Doesn't believe you? Stop. Okay, now I know, right? So pain does that for us, and whether it's physical pain or emotional pain, it does that for us about a variety of things, right? And again, as I said, it's not just physical pain. It's what we could call mental or emotional pain. There's value in that as well. And of course, the Bible talks about this in places like James chapter 1. Talks about counting it all joy when we fall into troubles and to temptations and to trials. Not because the thing itself is good, but because the result that can occur is so good. And so you think about traits in human beings, they're just the highest, the most noble, the most admirable, the most desirable traits, the most looked up to for human beings to have. None of them can exist with no pain, with no suffering, with no inconvenience. None of them can exist in a flawless world. I'm talking about things like patience, bravery, or courage, determination, persistence, inner strength, gratitude, things like empathy, things like sympathy. Those don't have any meaning at all in a world where no one ever experiences anything unpleasant. Right? Those serve to help us become better people internally. They make us stronger. They make us better able to appreciate troubles that other people are having. They help us to understand ourselves better and what our limits are. And also, coincidentally, they just fall into line very well with the kind of soul development that God wants to occur in this world, the kind of growing that he wants us to do. And again, in a world where nobody ever suffers anything, nobody struggles anything, they never have a disappointment, they never have a setback, those terms, those concepts just, they go out the window. There's no meaning for them. There's no need for them. Again, so we go back to the fact that this world is this ideal realm for soul development. And then we can also think about suffering in the sense that suffering can be beneficial because sometimes it ends suffering. And forgive me, this one's personal. This one just dawned on me when I was developing this lesson. When Mom died, nearly 11 years ago now, It hurt all of us terribly. But for her, it was an end of her suffering. And so, which way would we have it? I think most of you know Mom had so many physical maladies. Every day of her life was physical pain to some degree of some kind. It had been for years. And while that heart attack that ended her life was so painful for all of us who were left behind, it was an end to her pain. And so it helps us to look at pain in that sense, to understand that there can be benefits that we don't understand. And then one other that we'll note under this one, now two others. Our suffering can be instructive for others. I've known of people who were suffering terribly in some medical condition, some protracted medical condition, in some, hospital, medical facility of some kind, just hanging on and asking the question. And the question is perfectly understandable. Why am I still here? Why am I still alive? I just want to go. I want to be done with it. And, no human being can know the answer perfectly to questions like that. We're going to talk about that in just a little bit. But part of the reason may be to set a certain kind of example for the people that are caring for you. Maybe there's something significant about the way this person looks at death versus the way the average person looks at death. I think about the story of Job. We get a peek behind the scenes then, and we'll come back to Job in a minute too. But obviously terrible things are happening to Job, and he doesn't understand why, and he wants to understand why. And there's not a thing wrong with any of that right there, all right? But I have no doubt, because of what we're told about it, and because it exists in God's word, that a part of why all that's happening is so we can learn from it. So God could have it recorded so we could learn from it. And we never know, what all the possibilities are in terms of potential benefits for suffering. And then one other that I'll mention, suffering and evil. And some of our songs have indicated this, and rightfully so. Suffering and evil serve to remind us that this world is not designed to be our forever home. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 13, we are strangers here. And many other passages make it clear. We're pilgrims here. We're not supposed to be perfectly comfortable here. We're not supposed to think about this as the place that we're going to live forever. Job 3 and verse 17 talks about a place where the wicked cease from troubling and the weary are at rest. It's not here. It's what comes after here. And so, again, God wants souls for heaven, not to live on this earth for eternity. That's not his plan. And suffering can serve to remind us of that. I suspect, I'm not going to speak for anybody else but myself, but I suspect because of the prosperity in which we live, the relative prosperity in which we live and have lived all of our lives, it's very easy to get more comfortable here than we should, to get more comfortable with the comforts of this life than we should, to get to thinking that, we're doing well financially and health's good and all of that. We got everything under control. What do we need? Right? Well, suffering can remind us that no, that's not the case. We're not in control, and this is not forever, and it's not supposed to be. God wants something so much better than this for us, and suffering helps us remember that. So, even though, as we've been discussing, there's a lot that we can understand about the existence of and the justification for evil and suffering in this world, we've still got to acknowledge that there are instances that we can't make sense of. It's easy to make sense of it from the large-scale perspective, just looking at the world at large and all of that, but when you get down to personal examples, sometimes it's just tough. Things that we witness, things that happen to us or happen to people that are close to us, that are very painful, that they seem so evil and so unjust and so nonsensical. At the end of the day, we just don't know why certain things happen, why certain things have to be the way that they are. And it's times like those when we may be tempted to doubt God. to blame God, to wonder, does God really know what he's doing? Why would he let this happen? We need to remember that though we may not know why, we know why we don't know why. It's because we're not God. We don't have his knowledge. We don't have his wisdom. We don't have his perspective on things. Going back to the original statement of the problem, right? Evil exists in the world. If God wants to get rid of evil and he can't do it, well, he's not all powerful. If he could get rid of evil but he just won't do it, he's not good. Focusing on just 2, at the most 3 of God's attributes and ignoring everything else. God's not just all powerful and he's not just all good and all loving. He's all knowing. He's all wise. And our faith needs to be invested in that just as much as any other of God's infinite traits. We don't have the entire blueprint. We don't have the entire game plan. And we couldn't possibly comprehend it if we did. But God does. And he understands it all perfectly. From the beginning to the end. From the end to the beginning. He has since before the creation of this world. And there's a lot of different, analogies that we can use to try to help us think about this concept. We can think of it as just this rich, complex tapestry, and it's huge and it's so variable and it's got so many little elements to it. And, how much of it do we get to look at in one lifetime? Or if you want to go higher tech, we can think of it as this huge video display. And it's made up of billions, perhaps trillions of little pixels that make the whole picture come together. And we're just looking at this minuscule part of it over here, not having a clue what the whole thing looks like or how this minuscule part fits into the whole thing. That's our perspective versus God's. If you think about every, quote, event that has ever happened or ever will happen in the history of this world, it's mind-boggling. It's a number beyond our ability to even imagine. It's like the 10 with 100 zeros after it. It literally is. If you think about every possible thing that could have happened or has happened in this world since its beginning, and then stretching on until God decides to bring it to an end. And how much of that, what percentage of that can each of us actually see and actually analyze and actually claim to have any kind of understanding of in one lifetime? Well, see, that's a number so small that it boggles the imagination, right? That's like 1 over a 10 with 100 zeros. But that's the difference in our perspective about this life and what goes on in it and God. So, of course, there are going to be things that happen to us and to other people that we can't make sense of. And there are going to be times when we're going to be tempted to ask, why, God? And I want to point out that there's nothing inherently wrong with that question. There's nothing inherently wrong with wanting to be able to understand, if it's possible, why certain things are happening to us, why certain things are happening to other people. We talked about Job. You may remember, and we're not going to recap the whole story of Job at this point, but horrible things happened to Job. And then some friends come to visit him, and they try to convince him it's just because he got secret sin and he needs to fess up to it, and then things are going to be all right. And he maintains his innocence on that throughout, and he's correct, right? And he wants to know why, which who wouldn't in that type of circumstance, right? He's not faulted for any of that, all right? The fault is for him, and it can be for us, is in thinking that we have the right or the ability to understand everything that God is doing in his world. And that if we can't understand it, well, then God owes us an explanation. That's where Job got off track. And in the closing chapters of that book, he's brought up short regarding that attitude. God asks him a series of rhetorical questions which demonstrate in stark fashion that Job didn't have the first clue about how God made this world and how it all works and what keeps it all running. And we're in the very same situation. And we have to remember that at all times. And we have to trust God. We have to trust that God knows what he's doing, that he has the entire blueprint, the entire plan, the entire tapestry, and that it does make sense when you have the capabilities of seeing the whole thing and you know what the goal is for everything. You know, you think about Romans 8 and verse 18. Should be a very familiar passage to us. This is where Paul said, we know that all things work together for good to them that love the Lord. Now, that's a very comforting promise, but it's really important to note two things that are not promised in that passage. We're not promised that all things are good. It doesn't say everything that happens to you is going to be good. No, it's not. But it does promise that God can work all things that happen to us, good, bad, or neutral, for good. Right? But something else it doesn't promise, and this is maybe the tougher one, it doesn't promise that we're going to get to see the good or understand it. That'd be nice, but we may never see or understand the good that God can bring about by bad things happening to us and to those we love. And that's just the way it is when you consider an infinite God with an infinite plan versus finite beings that only exist in this world for, a blink of an eye to God. We may never be able to, there's no may, we will never be able to comprehend the full effect out into the future of the events that we see and experience in our lives. We may see some of the effect, but we'll never see all of it because our lives don't go on long enough to be able to see all of it. All of the effects that could possibly occur by various decisions we make or things that happen to us, or decisions we make as a result of things that happen to us. And this is described in various ways. It can be called the ripple effect. And that's simply referring to the act of, take a small pebble and toss it into a perfectly still pond. What happens? We get this one little spot where it goes poop, and then out from that come these ripples. Well, assume you're the pebble, right? And whatever happens, whatever event it is, that's just you hitting the surface of the pond, all right? So you hit it, that's your experience, down you go. You don't have a clue what's happening up there with all those ripples. You don't get to see them. That's us in terms of so many things in this life. Some people call it the butterfly effect, which I didn't look this up, but my assumption would be that something as seemingly trivial and insignificant as the flapping of a butterfly's wing can have effects far into the future that nobody could have predicted. And just as one example of something that we can easily see and understand, and it is perfectly plausible. In fact, I have no doubt that it has absolutely happened numerous times in this life. Let's think about a young woman who is raped. And as a result, she's carrying a child. And she decides, against all advice to the contrary, that she's not going to make the innocent baby pay with its life for someone else's sin, for someone else's evil deeds. And so she carries the child and she delivers the child. And then let's just say, for sake of this example, she dies in childbirth. And the child is given up for adoption. And so, fortunately, he's adopted by a Christian family. And he grows up learning the Word of God. And he eventually obeys the gospel. And he leads many others to Christ. And he has a family of his own. And many of his sons become preachers and lead many more people to Christ. We can see so easily and clearly how that finite, imperfect woman brought good out of something evil, never knowing the full effect of how it could be. So it shouldn't be that hard for us to trust that the all-powerful, all-good, all-knowing creator and sustainer of this universe can do the same. And in fact, he was doing just that in the example that we noted. And then finally, in thinking about this problem of evil, is God's answer to it. As we mentioned earlier, evil's not a problem for God. It's a problem for us, introduced by us. But the entire Christian story, the entire scheme of redemption, Genesis to Revelation, is the answer. It's God's answer to the problem of evil. Yes, evil exists because Satan exists and because human beings with free will exist. But God inserted himself into this world as one of us, as a human being, in the form of the Son, Jesus Christ. And he did that to both suffer evil with us in complete innocence and overcome evil, taking our sins, our evil on himself, and providing us with an escape from the ultimate consequences of evil. So again, God wants our souls to be developed to the point where we are prepared to spend eternity with him. And part of that requires suffering on our part. Something else that one of the songs we sang alluded to is that there are so many experiences, and this is true of this life, and I have no doubt that it'll be true in eternity. We can't experience them fully as God would have us to without going through the suffering, without knowing what it's like to struggle. And there's many ways to illustrate that, but I know we can all think of examples of things that we've had to struggle with. But once we finally fought through whatever it was and overcame whatever it was, we knew we were better people for it. And there was satisfaction in being able to do that. There's value in that as well. And so as we think about God's offer to all people to reconcile themselves to him through his Son, Jesus, there's never a promise there that making that decision is going to make your life a bed of roses. We do people a disservice if we ever give them the idea that that's what Christianity is going to be about. Just do this and everything's going to be perfect in your life. Everything will be perfect spiritually, but that's no guarantee about how things are going to be physically. Nevertheless, God knows what is best for us from an eternal perspective. He's revealed enough of that to us in his word that we can grasp it. We can grasp all we need to about the value of the spiritual and the eternal over the physical. And he wants us to be able to be with him. That can't happen until we choose freely to come to him. Of course, we do that by hearing his word. We do that by coming into contact with his specific message for that. Romans chapter 10, we see that our faith is developed by our hearing of the word. And then we must put our faith in him. By faith we are saved. We must turn away from sin. We must turn away from evil, as we talked about this morning. Jesus, in that same passage in Luke 13, when he was talking about the Tower of Siloam, said, except you repent, you're all likewise going to perish. We cannot continue in sin and be right with God and live within his grace. And then, as we noted, we need to confess Christ openly. We need to be very clear about the side that we have chosen while we're in this realm. At that point, we're ready to put Christ on in baptism, to be baptized into his death, as Paul mentioned in Romans chapter 6. To be part of his body, part of his fellowship, as Ephesians chapter 1 tells us, to be in the place where every spiritual blessing is found, also in Ephesians chapter 1. And that is our invitation this afternoon, as it is God's invitation from his word, to turn away from a life that is focused on this world and on its troubles, and turn to God and live the life that he directs in his word. Make him our master instead of the things of this world. If we can help anyone with that or with any other spiritual matter this afternoon, then we invite and encourage you to